So now I get to be the person that gets to talk about the multilateral system, which and it's very interesting, of course, that we've kind of saved up multilaterals for one of our final reports. As Edward commented, clearly this is a very, very big part of DFID's world. It is some 60% of all money that is dispersed through DFID, which this year or last year would have been £6.3 billion. And in terms of how you think about that, it actually means that 40% of the money that DFID spends goes in core contributions to the multilateral organisations, and a further 20% is how much of their bilateral activity they spend through the same multilateral organisation. So that adds up to the fact that there's some 60% of the total funding going through these organisations, and that means that in fact there's a huge mutual dependency. There are many of these organisations for which now DFID is the largest funder, and as UK funding has been increasing and as other donors around the world have been decreasing, that has been increasingly the case. And also, of course, for DFID, in terms of when they're looking around for who to work with, the multilateral agencies has become a very, very big part of their dependency on delivery, as well as they look to commission work around the world. It's probably worth spending just a few moments just saying who do we mean by the multilateral system, because it's a word that's bandied around a lot, and frankly a word I didn't understand at all before I was a commissioner. So I actually think, by the way, there's a wider point about that I'll come back to later around the multilateral system. But what we included in this particular review was we included the development banks, so particularly obviously the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the EU, which is an interesting example of a multilateral. We actually really more of I call a pooled bilateral rather more than a multilateral, but it operates with some very interesting kind of similar protocols that some of the multilaterals do, and in terms of its relationship and some of the transparency points that we see in other multilaterals, the EU shares some of those characteristics. A large part of this, of course, is the UN system. The UN system in all its forms. So that's both the normative agencies, the ones that are setting normative goals around the world, like WHO that sets the goals for health, for example, but also a number of them that are engaged with delivery as well. So ones that are actually engaged on the ground, like UNICEF, UNDP, and others, in actually running and managing programs around the world. And that's kind of interesting seeing the way they use for normative and for delivery purposes. And then there's also the vertical agencies, so vertical funds, so things like the Global Fund, Gavi, etc., also operate in a multilateral way as well. So those were the organisations that were kind of in our remit as we thought about the multilateral system. And of course we've bumped into the multilateral system in pretty much every single report we've written over the past 4 years as well. There's been very few reports where I would say we were not in some way commenting on them in some role or relationship, because they are pretty much omnipresent in the world of development, as indeed they are at one level supposed to be. It was interesting though, as part of our methodology for this particular review, we actually did a sort of a summary casebook on some 47 multilateral organisations as a way of kind of pulling together what we could learn about where they were, what they were doing, where they were being funded by DFID, which countries they were working in, which kind of programmes they were working on. And I was encouraging some recent conversations with DFID people to say how useful that resource was going to be to them now, to actually have a bit of a handle on where some of this picture is, because the reality is this is a very complex portfolio of relationships, and whether it's the directly funded pieces, whether it's the bilateral pieces, whether it's the trust funds, there are many components here that make it quite hard to keep a handle around that. In terms of our methodology, we used that kind of early scan to then kind of pick out around 17 organisations that were the larger, more fundamental to the delivery agenda of DFID as for more deep focus. We obviously looked at what we'd learned from our various prior ICAI reports. We looked at DFID's own information it uses for assessing multilaterals from the MAR onwards in terms of its processes for that. And then we did deep dives in a number of countries, desk reviews in Burma and Vietnam, and then our field work was in Madagascar and in Uganda. And you might say, well, why did we choose Madagascar and Uganda? We chose Madagascar because it's a place where DFID does not have an office, but where actually the multilateral system is pretty present and playing a pretty key role. So to understand a little bit about how does the multilateral system work in a world where there is no DFID, and then to use Uganda, which is a very mature, both multilateral and mature DFID world, and to get a sense of kind of those two pieces to it. So that was kind of our methodology in terms of the review. I think it's very important in looking at this review to read the title of it carefully, because this was a review that was about how well DFID works with the multilateral system to achieve its impact around the world. It's about the relationship and the effectiveness of DFID's relationship with these organisations, not about assessing the multilaterals purely around their own performance. So this report, and to some extent the reason why it's come out with an overall green amber, is that in our assessment and looking around the patch we've looked at it, DFID's interactions with the system are among the more effective that we see around the world, whether that's interactions at the headquarters level or interactions on the ground in country. At multiple levels and in programs, we see DFID actually being generally pretty effective in influencing and driving that process. It's not that we don't find also a number of areas for concern, which we highlight in the report, and we have some wider commentary on whether actually, on the multilateral system itself, and some of its comments about fitness for purpose moving forward. This report's focus was largely looking back over the past 4 or 5 years of the relationship, but we were also importantly trying to provide, given where we are in timing, some important guidance for the future, because there will be clearly important allocation decisions coming up in the next period around the use of the multilateral system. There will be a new MAR or assessment process of multilaterals coming forward. We feel that's a very important time for the government to look at the multilateral system and how it's going to work going forward, because we see, in a way, the challenge of the world that Graham described that DFID is facing in terms of new players, in terms of a world of SDGs rather than MDGs, and a world where perhaps economic development is going to be a bigger part of the agenda than some of the traditional aid modalities. All those challenges are massive challenges for the multilateral system as well, because in fact they've been used to working in this kind of past modality. And one of the big questions going forward will be how fast will they reform and change to work in this new world, and how well will their mandates extend to deal with issues that we are in, say, in Syria, in Somalia, in Nigeria, where we have real problems based on religion and Islam to deal with. How well does a kind of a Western-centric multilateral system deal with those kind of issues? Is one of the big questions going forward, and I think that's one of the big underlying things that we see. Of course, looking forward, some of the funding is non-discretionary. Quite a bit of this money is actually non-discretionary. You don't get to choose to spend it. It kind of comes in the package of being a player on the world stage. It comes in the package of being a member of the EU. So quite a large part of this money is effectively, it's going to be spent. The question is, how well is it spent? And there are other choices that are made around some of the discretionary areas, both with regard to actually discretionary with regard to the EU, and certainly with regard to the bilateral funding that's being spent with these organisations in country. So it's in both those areas we feel there's opportunities to look forward. If we think about what came out from the report in a kind of a more positive way, and I've hinted at a couple of these areas, overall, I mean, the case for multilateralism, I think we still found had relevance. It matters that there are some of these bodies that have a degree of political neutrality, that are able to have global presence in places that are very difficult for others to have a presence in. We saw particularly in Madagascar where UNICEF had held up the education system after the recent issues with the system, the political systems in Madagascar. And if they hadn't been there would have been no ongoing education going on in that part of the world. And there are many other cases that we saw in our visit to northern Uganda. Again, if the UN agencies together with DFID had not been present there, the underlying poverty that affects that Karamoja region would not be being dealt with. They are actually at the heart of being in some difficult places and solving some of the difficult challenges. And I think as a particular interesting lens on this is the lens around fragile states. Because again, fragile states are places where trying to work out what anyone's mandate is to operate is tricky. But actually the multilateral system can often have a rationale and a hand to come in and a reason to come in and a reason to be there to be effective. It doesn't always mean they're able to operate it, though. I was commenting earlier that on my trip I was in Somalia and Mogadishu for one of our reviews last year on fragile states. And I was struck by a conversation with the lady from WHO who had been running their major health program in Somalia for the previous 18 months, that she had not been able to get out of the compound in 18 months of running the program there. So although you think you've got a sort of a mandate and an access that comes from this, it doesn't necessarily happen, because even these organisations don't have access, and as more of the global problems are in more and more remote and difficult places with conflict in them, they're going to face the same challenges that DFID has about how do you work in these kinds of environments going forward. I think also we've seen positives with regard to the learning and research agenda that these organisations drive. The normative agencies do play a big role in developing important standards, important ideas that are valuable around the world, around things like gender-based violence or the role of women in society and other health-related, and even some things we've seen very powerfully around the Sun Alliance for Nutrition, where the global players have played a big part in helping to set some very important learnings around that area. So there's a role there that's very important too. And finally, from our impact, we do see them make a difference. These organisations are making a difference on the ground. They have many also committed, professional and effective people who are making a big part of the difference that's being made around the world. Having said that, there are a number of other challenges we've seen with this picture. The first is really one around proliferation and the fact that there are so many of these agencies, and how they interact and how they sort of manifest themselves both in country, but frankly in a district, or even, to Diana's point, in a village, can be pretty interesting in terms of the lack of coordination or the overlap or the proliferation or the fragmentation of effort that we see there. With regards to coordination, efforts at coordination, particularly let's take a look in the UN system around creating the one UN model, have fundamentally from our work we see as having failed to date to a very large extent. I mean, there are examples where even when we were in Uganda, they were celebrating the fact they just shared their annual plans together for the first time in the country. That like a week before. I mean, so it was, and that was a celebration of it. And we looked at Vietnam about how that had evolved, and also found similar challenges there. I think that one of the question marks going forward, and we come on some of our recommendations, are around actually trying to coordinate across the whole one UN is not the answer. What needs to start to happen is effective coalitions of agencies working with donors around specific problems is the way to try and solve for this, rather than eat the elephant as a great big bureaucratic, integrated management problem. Just one piece of our thinking that comes out of that. I think we found also that these agencies are very, like DFID, dependent on the quality of the people they have in the different parts of the world. And one of the challenges with the MAR was the MAR in the past largely looked at institutional assessment of the multilateral system. It didn't, and checked it against some of the goals and objectives that DFID had, as opposed to really understanding whether actually UNICEF are good for WASH in DRC or not. Because UNICEF might be very good for WASH globally, they may be very good for education globally, but actually trying to work out at a more granular level where the effectiveness of these agencies is really important. And one of our big findings is around DFID really understanding at a country perspective where the strengths and weaknesses of the players really are, and using them for their strengths and filling in their gaps, as opposed to assuming you get the whole package behind the label, as it were, for these players. I think that we've generally had some perspectives also around the transparency of these organisations. That there's been a big push from DFID, which has been quite effective, around the results focus and the reform of the results focus, and all of these agencies have felt DFID's strong hand around results agenda. Very, very much so. They very much feel that they've been, what they would say, positively reinforced about pushing on for focusing on results. Having said that, as we found from our kind of attempt to try and summarise their information around the world for our own purposes, the degree of absolute transparency about who's doing what where with our money is relatively low. And so the ability for things like aid orphans, we sort of identified Madagascar to be a place where, sitting between Asia and Africa, nobody's quite got their eye on it, and yet has some of the worst indicators in the world. That's because no one's seeing that whole picture and responding to it in terms of choices being made by individual agencies across the patch. And finally, I think our concerns that treat on our impact report is, when you look at it, the number of these agencies that can truly point to having had transformative impact that has stuck in these countries, despite many, many years of being there, is relatively limited. So this issue of transformative impact and seeing the arc, you'd think we'd find more examples of that, and I think we think that's the big agenda for them moving forward, is how do we see more of that working with DFID. So now coming on to DFID's assessment, how we felt DFID's work with them. As I say, overall, our overarching message here is, DFID does a good job of working with these players. At the headquarters levels, I heard from many of the headquarters about that. Having said that, they have felt, again, this kind of, I'd say, the cold wind of the results agenda, perhaps rather more than the warm wind of the ideas agenda and the content agenda. So I think that where they saw in the past, DFID had been a real interlocutor around content, they were concerned that now more of the interactions were sort of at the process level. And that's something that we come on to in our recommendations as well. I think at the country level, again, we've seen DFID being very effective in its attempts at coordination, chairing coordinating bodies, bringing the agencies together as much as they possibly can. But again, perhaps an increasing focus has been on due diligence and on following through on whether a particular agency can follow the money and manage the money effectively in that country, perhaps rather more than worrying about whether this is the right agency with the right people and the right leadership to do what I actually want to do in that particular part of the world. So it's the focus of due diligence has been an interesting area of learning for that. So I think when we came to our recommendations, a number of things stood out to us. The first is back to my overarching picture. It's 47 organisations. There's these different categories of development banks, normative agencies, delivery agencies. Where is there a statement or a view from DFID about how it sees these players playing in the architecture going forward? What's the role they've been playing? Are they going to just be a series of development partners that we're going to use when we can around the world? Do we think we actually have an agenda around some of the normative ones we want to really focus on and be clear about their role? With regard to the development banks, do we think that infrastructure is going to be an agenda for the next 5-10 years? And do we have a strategy for how to use the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, together with the EU and the World Bank, to do some really important things with regard to infrastructure across? And how do we deal with the role of China in that relationship, for example, strategically? What's our view of these large global funds? Are we going to carry on proliferating new global initiatives and adding them to the list? Or do we actually have a view that we've kind of got enough now, we need to rationalise them in some respect? So our overarching first message is, if you're going to spend, as we think you are, 35 billion minimum over the next 5 years in the multilateral system, it'd be a good idea to have a strategy about how you think you're going to do that, and what the major roles and responsibilities will be of the major groups and organisations, some of which I say you have no choice over using, some of which you have choices about using. The second recommendation says take that idea and bring it down into the country. And back to the comments we've made about the coherence of the country portfolios and thinking about the impact that DFID is going to have with all that it does in country. And our view is that, again, when they look at the country poverty reduction diagnostic, the opportunity to open that up and include in it an assessment of the landscape of multilaterals in that particular environment, the strengths, the weaknesses, the positioning of the different players, such that when you start to bring business cases up, you're doing so against a sense of that landscape and how to be effective at a country level from a strategy point of view. And again, let's be clear, in Zimbabwe, what is the role of the African Development Bank, for example? What's it going to be as my partner? What could it be as my partner? More top-down thinking rather than simply waiting for these agencies to respond to a particular RFP. But another of our key findings, which has been a surprise, is that while there's all this core funding going in, relatively little of the core funding is actually reaching the ground in the key countries. A lot of the core funding is going into the infrastructure of the agencies, and many of the agencies are very dependent on bilateral funding in country to fund their in-country presence. And as a result of that, there are quite distorted behaviours can start to come in, where an agency starts to make itself look as much like the next programme coming from DFID as it possibly can, rather than being the thing that it should be in that particular country. So some big lessons there as they become, again, tin cupping around the donor community to try and maintain their presence in a changing world. That's going to be a real challenge to make sure that doesn't lead to further fragmentation, dilution, etc. So this country view is going to be really important for DFID to hold the line on that. We have a view about, if you're going to have 60% of your money going through this, you need to have more of your people worrying about these organisations and their relationships, and more senior people worrying about these organisations and their relationships. We feel that the ENC, the top board of DFID, need to own the key relationships more completely. They need to be very aware of stronger cadres of people, as they are with the World Bank, down through the organisation, to the network that holds these relationships together both centrally and in key countries. And there'd be a line of, so that something comes up with UNICEF, you can get that line of command straight up through the place, you know where to go to work with the key relationships and how to develop them. And frankly, to reinforce this idea of ideas and not just policy flows between the two sides. We think there's more for DFID to do around pushing on transparency and accountability. That needs to be we use those words carefully. We think it's important for them to focus on transparency and accountability rather more necessarily than more process scrutiny. We think there's been quite a strong wave of that, which they've responded to, the multilaterals. There's a danger of that going too far and becoming a rationale its own sake, as opposed to stepping back and trying to work out which bit of the woods, the trees, do we really want to understand about these organisations, and let's make sure they're giving us that on a regularised basis so that we can make the right kind of judgments and decisions going forward and hold them accountable for that, and also hold them accountable for what they should be doing as a matter of course around process and around fiduciary controls and areas such as that. We think there's a real opportunity for DFID to focus on these effective coalitions. If we're going to execute the SDGs going forward, and there's going to be meaningful ways of creating functioning architectures in country, probably at regional levels inside countries, the role of DFID in shaping who should be on the ground with them. We thought the Karamojo example was a very good example where we saw UNICEF, FAO and WFP working with DFID in a very coordinated, integrated fashion. That's the kind of teaming we want to sort of see them encouraging more pragmatically going forward. We think there's a role for DFID to work with its other bilateral colleagues and donors to move these organisations forward together. Too much of it is actually DFID using its big voice and big stick to some extent, having one conversation and not necessarily working with the other donors in a coordinated fashion, both in country and certainly globally. And our final set of recommendations are, if I didn't know what multilaterals were 4 years ago, I can pretty much guarantee that 99.999% of the people who are taxpayers have no idea what multilaterals are either. And yet it is, when they think about the aid budget, do they really understand what role these organisations are playing? Do they really understand the importance of these organisations in the portfolio? The case for multilateralism needs to be made more crisply. So why we use them, and then also to explain again the value that comes from working with these kinds of organisations as opposed to doing it ourselves. And again, being clearer about what's working and being more open about where the challenges are with these kinds of organisations.